In the vast, silent heart of the Australian outback, a 4-year-old boy vanished into thin air.
There were no cries for help, no footprints leading away, and no sign of a struggle. It was as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed Gus Lamont whole. This is the story of a disappearance that defies all logic, a case where the absence of evidence became the most compelling clue of all. The search for answers continues, and every detail matters. The disappearance of Gus Lamont is a puzzle that begins with an almost supernatural void. On a sprawling, isolated sheep station, a landscape where every step leaves an impression on the red dirt and soft sand, a young boy was there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind nothing but an unnerving silence. For a child to vanish from such an environment without a single trace is a circumstance so rare it challenges the fundamental principles of search and rescue. In the vast majority of cases, especially in a natural setting, a trail exists. A child wandering off will leave footprints, especially in the sandy areas where Gus was last seen playing. They might drop a toy, snag a piece of clothing on a thorny bush, or disturb the undergrowth as they pass. Even in the event of a tragic accident, such as a fall, there would be signs, a scuff mark on a rock, displaced stones, or evidence of a small slide. If wildlife were involved, the signs would be different but equally present, animal tracks, drag marks, or other forensic evidence. Yet, from the very first moments of the search at Oak Park Station, none of these expected clues materialized. The ground around the sand mound where he was last seen was unmarked, presenting a smooth, unbroken surface that offered no direction, no hint of which way he might have gone. This complete lack of physical evidence immediately elevated the case from a tragic accident to a profound mystery. It forced investigators to confront a baffling reality: how does a living, breathing, active child simply evaporate from a landscape that is so quick to record the passage of even the smallest creature? The terrain itself, while rugged, was not so impenetrable that it would completely obscure all signs of a 4-year-old's passage. The initial search teams, comprised of local police and experienced trackers, combed the immediate area with a growing sense of disbelief. They used sticks to gently part the tall grass, peered into crevices between rocks, and scanned the ground for the slightest impression. Search dogs, trained to pick up the faintest human scent, worked in widening circles but found nothing to follow. Their failure to pick up a trail was particularly telling. It suggested that either Gus's scent ended abruptly, a circumstance that is difficult to explain, or that conditions had somehow erased it, which seemed equally improbable given the relatively calm weather. As the search intensified, technology was brought in to scour the property from above. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras flew systematic grid patterns over the station, their lenses capturing every gully, every dry creek bed, and every patch of scrubland. The aerial footage was analyzed frame by frame, with experts looking for any anomaly in the pattern of the land, a patch of disturbed soil, an odd color that could indicate clothing, or a shape that didn't belong. Again, the result was the same: nothing. The property appeared exactly as it should, a vast, untouched wilderness that held its secret tightly. This utter void of physical clues had a profound impact on the investigation's trajectory. Without a footprint, a scrap of fabric, or a single broken twig to guide them, investigators were thrust into a realm of pure deduction. The case could no longer be solved by following a trail on the ground, it had to be solved by piecing together a story from the people who were there. The absence of evidence became, in itself, a form of evidence. It pointed away from a simple wandering-off scenario and forced a consideration of other, more complex possibilities. It suggested that perhaps the scene investigators were presented with was not the original scene of the disappearance. In a landscape that so readily reveals movement, the only way for there to be no trace is if no trace was left to find, or if any trace that existed was meticulously erased. This chilling possibility transformed the investigation, shifting the focus from the unforgiving outback to the human beings at the center of the storm, and to the critical, unexplained delay that preceded the first call for help. That call for help, when it finally came, arrived 3 hours after Gus was last seen. In the world of missing children, 3 hours is not just a delay, it is an eternity. The first few hours following a child's disappearance are universally recognized as the most critical, a narrow window of opportunity when the trail is freshest, scent dogs are most effective, and the child is most likely to be found close by and unharmed. Every minute that ticks by sees that trail growing colder, the potential search area expanding exponentially, and the odds of a positive outcome diminishing. The account of that afternoon, as provided by the adults on the property, describes a period of time that stands in stark contrast to the frantic, desperate urgency that typically defines such a crisis. According to the timeline that was eventually pieced together, Gus was last seen around 5 p.m. The sun would have been low in the sky, casting long shadows that could easily conceal a small child. The normal, expected reaction upon realizing a 4-year-old is missing is one of immediate and escalating panic. It involves calling his name, searching the immediate vicinity, under beds, in closets, behind sheds, with increasing frenzy, and then, when he is not immediately found, contacting neighbors and authorities without a moment's hesitation. In remote communities, this communal response is often instinctual, everyone understands the dangers of the land and mobilizes instantly. Yet, at Oak Park Station, this did not happen. The official report to police was not logged until approximately 8 p.m. Those 3 hours represent a profound and puzzling gap. What transpired during that time? The explanations provided were of a more methodical, contained search of the immediate homestead area. One adult was reportedly attending to sheep, another inside the house, a third preparing a meal. When laid out, these activities seem almost mundane, creating a narrative of a calm, orderly response that is deeply at odds with the terrifying reality of a missing child in a dangerous environment. This delay had tangible, detrimental consequences for the investigation. By the time police and volunteer searchers arrived, full darkness had enveloped the property, rendering ground searches nearly impossible and forcing a halt until dawn. The critical first night, when Gus would have been most vulnerable to the cold and wildlife, was largely lost. Furthermore, the delay gave any potential scent left by Gus more time to dissipate in the dry, moving air, explaining, at least in part, why the search dogs failed to find a usable trail. The 3-hour gap also introduced a layer of behavioral complexity that investigators could not ignore. Human behavior in a crisis, while varied, typically follows certain patterns of heightened emotion and desperate action. A delay of this magnitude, particularly in an isolated setting where the dangers are well known, is a significant anomaly. It raises difficult questions. Was it a result of a mistaken belief that he was simply hiding and would soon be found? Was it caused by confusion or miscommunication among the adults? Or did it stem from a desire to resolve the situation internally before involving outside authorities? There is also the troubling detail that Gus's own father was reportedly not notified until after the search had begun, meaning he was unaware his son was missing for a significant portion of that critical window. For investigators, this delay became a central pillar of the mystery. It was not merely a lost opportunity to find Gus, it was an action, or rather an inaction, that required explanation. In the absence of physical evidence, the sequence of events and the choices made by the people involved became the primary evidence. The 3-hour wait was a choice that stood out, a deviation from the expected script of a child in peril emergency, and it cast a long shadow over everything that followed, including the scale and strategy of the official search that was finally launched. When the search did begin, its initial scope was, in the view of many experts, fatally limited. For the first 6 days, the official search focused on a radius of approximately 2 kilometers from the point where Gus was last seen. On the surface, this might seem a reasonable starting point, a manageable area for teams to scour thoroughly before expanding outward. However, in the context of a missing child in the outback, this 2-kilometer radius was almost certainly too small. A 4-year-old child, while small, can be deceptively mobile. In a state of curiosity or fear, a child can cover more ground than most adults would anticipate. Furthermore, the terrain at Oak Park Station is not a flat, featureless plain, it is a complex landscape of rolling sand dunes, gullies, and scrub that can both conceal a child and channel his movement in unexpected directions. A child could have followed an animal trail, been drawn to the shimmer of a distant water hole, or simply wandered in a straight line, easily covering a kilometer or more in a short span of time. By constraining the search to a 2-kilometer zone for nearly a week, investigators were potentially operating under a false assumption, one that may have left vast, critical areas completely unexamined during the most important phase of the operation. It was only after 6 days that the search was significantly expanded to a 5-kilometer radius. While this was a necessary and logical step, it came with a heavy cost. Those 6 days allowed weather, wind, and animal activity to degrade any potential evidence that might have existed beyond the original search perimeter. A faint footprint in the sand could have been erased by the wind, a piece of clothing could have been covered by blowing dust or carried off by an animal. The trail, if it ever existed beyond that 2-kilometer circle, was now irrevocably cold. The decision to wait so long to widen the search has been a point of quiet contention among search and rescue professionals. Standard protocols often emphasize the need for rapid, expansive searching in the first 48 hours, especially in wilderness settings. The delay suggests that investigators may have been initially convinced that Gus could not have traveled far, a conviction that may have been influenced by the accounts of the adults on the property or by the complete lack of a trail leading outwards. This creates a circular logic. The absence of evidence near the house was used to justify a limited search, but that limited search failed to find evidence further out, which in turn was used to reinforce the idea that he never left the immediate area. It was a frustrating paradox that ultimately hampered the investigation. The expanded search, when it finally began, was exhaustive. It involved grid searches on foot, with volunteers walking arm in arm to ensure no square meter was missed. Drones and helicopters crisscrossed the skies. Specific areas of interest, such as water holes and dams, were drained or dredged, a painstaking process meant to rule out the possibility of a drowning, even though the lack of footprints leading to any water source made this seem unlikely. The discovery of a single, lone boot print near a sand dune during this expanded search offered a fleeting moment of hope, but it was an isolated clue that led nowhere. It was photographed and analyzed, but without other prints to create a trail, its significance remained unclear. Was it Gus's? Was it from another day? It became a symbol of the entire search, a tantalizing but ultimately useless fragment in a vast emptiness. The 6-day delay in expanding the search perimeter represents a catastrophic loss of time, a window of opportunity that was closed forever. It forced the investigation to play a desperate game of catch-up, searching for clues that had long since faded in a landscape that had already moved on. As the physical search yielded nothing, the attention of investigators turned inevitably toward the human element. In any missing person case, but especially one involving a child, the behavior of the parents and caregivers is closely observed. While grief and stress manifest in countless ways, there are common threads of visible anguish, desperate urgency, and public appeals that are almost universal. In the case of Gus Lamont, it was the absence of these expected behaviors that became a source of intense scrutiny and growing unease. From the very beginning, the public-facing response from the adults closest to Gus was characterized by a profound and unsettling silence. There were no tearful press conferences, no impassioned pleas for his safe return broadcast on national television, no interviews with media outlets begging for information. This silence was deafening. Instead of reaching out, the family retreated behind the gates of their remote property, managing their interactions with the outside world with a cautious, measured control that stood in stark contrast to the raw emotion the public expected to see. When they did interact with authorities, their statements were often described as brief, sometimes contradictory, and delivered with a detachment that lacked the visible remorse or self-blame that is so common in these situations. There was no visible outrage, no frantic mobilization of their own networks, no grief that seemed to match the horrific reality of a lost child in the Australian bush. Even more telling was the apparent lack of suspicion among the adults themselves. In a household facing such a terrifying and unexplained event, it is normal for tension to run high. Questions are asked, timelines are debated, and accusations, however fleeting, can surface in the heat of fear and confusion. Here, that internal dynamic seemed muted, almost entirely absent. The adults presented a unified, if silent, front, with no public challenges to each other's accounts or visible attempts to reconcile the inconsistencies that investigators were beginning to uncover. This absence of the expected emotional landscape did not go unnoticed by behavioral analysts. Experts who study these cases note that while there is no single, right, way to grieve, certain behaviors are so consistently present in genuine crises that their absence becomes a red flag. The lack of a public appeal, for instance, is highly unusual. For most families, the drive to use every possible avenue to find their child is overwhelming. Their faces become the public face of the search, their tears a powerful motivator for public assistance. The decision not to do this is a conscious choice, and one that requires explanation. It can suggest a desire for privacy, a fear of public scrutiny, or, in the most troubling interpretation, a knowledge that such an appeal is unnecessary or even risky. The family's movements in the weeks following the disappearance further intensified these concerns. Rumors began to circulate, fueled by whispers in the local community, that the family had put the Oak Park Station property up for sale almost immediately after Gus vanished. While the veracity of these rumors was difficult to confirm, their very existence added a new layer of unease. The act of selling a home after a tragedy is not in itself suspicious, but the timing, if true, seemed to signal a startlingly swift move to sever ties with the place where their child had disappeared. It created a perception, whether accurate or not, that the focus had shifted away from finding Gus and toward moving on with their lives. This combination of factors, the silence, the detachment, the unified front, and the property rumors, created a powerful narrative that existed alongside the official investigation. It was a narrative built not on what was done, but on what was not done. The expected emotional responses were missing, and in their place was a void that the public and investigators alike filled with growing suspicion. This behavioral evidence, though circumstantial, became crucial. With no physical trail to follow, the investigators had to follow the human trail, and that trail was leading them back, again and again, to the puzzling actions and inactions of the adults who were the last to see Gus Lamont alive. Faced with this baffling set of circumstances, no physical evidence, a significant delay, and unusual behavioral cues, the South Australia police were tasked with navigating a public relations tightrope. Their public statements throughout the investigation were masterclasses in cautious, deliberate neutrality. In nearly every update, the same carefully crafted phrase would appear: "There is no evidence of foul play at this time." To a casual observer, this might have sounded reassuring, a suggestion that the police believed it was still a simple case of a lost child. But to those more familiar with the language of law enforcement, the phrase carried a different, more nuanced meaning. It was a procedural holding pattern, a way of stating the facts without revealing the direction of their thinking. It meant that they had not yet uncovered definitive proof of a crime, but it absolutely did not mean they had ruled one out. This measured approach was reflected in every action they reported. They detailed the draining of dams, a thorough and logical step, but one they presented as a matter of due diligence rather than a response to a specific tip. They discussed the analysis of drone footage, emphasizing the technological effort without revealing whether it had yielded any results. They conducted internal reviews of the search efforts, acknowledging the scale of the operation without critiquing its initial limitations. This clinical, almost sterile communication style was undoubtedly frustrating for a public hungry for answers and eager for someone to blame. It felt cold, detached, and overly cautious. However, this approach was almost certainly strategic. The police were operating in an informational vacuum, and premature speculation could have been catastrophic. If they had publicly voiced suspicions about the family without hard evidence, they risked poisoning the jury pool, triggering a media frenzy that could overwhelm the investigation, and potentially causing the very people they needed to communicate with to retreat further into silence. By maintaining a neutral public stance, they kept all options on the table. They could continue to treat the family as both victims and, potentially, sources of information, without alerting them to the full focus of the investigation. This neutrality allowed them to patiently build their case on the only evidence available to them, the intricate and contradictory web of human behavior. The police statements were a mirror reflecting the case itself, on the surface, calm and orderly, but beneath, a swirling mass of unanswerable questions and unsettling possibilities. They were playing a long game, understanding that in a case with no body, no crime scene, and no obvious motive, patience and precision were their most powerful weapons. As the official investigation proceeded with quiet determination, the court of public opinion was far less restrained. In the vacuum left by the family's silence and the police's neutrality, rumors and speculation flourished, both in the nearby towns and across social media. The isolated Oak Park station became a symbol not of pastoral life, but of an impenetrable mystery. The local community, which initially would have rallied around the family, began to feel a growing sense of unease. The same tight-knit bonds that normally provided support now became conduits for doubt. Whispers about the 3-hour delay were amplified. The detached behavior of the family was analyzed over fences and in grocery store aisles. The rumor about the property being put up for sale spread like wildfire, cementing in many minds the perception of a family that was already moving on. This speculation was not born of malice, but of a profound need to make sense of the senseless. A child does not simply disappear without a trace. The human brain rebels against such a void and seeks to fill it with a narrative. The narrative that began to take hold, fueled by the absence of expected emotions and actions, was one of hidden knowledge. People began to question everything. Fleeting sightings of family members at odd hours were noted and dissected. The lack of a public appeal was interpreted not as grief, but as guilt. In the digital age, this local speculation became a national conversation. Online forums dedicated to true crime dissected every available detail of the case. Amateur sleuths pored over maps of the property, theorizing about places a body could be hidden. The family's every rumored action was held up to the light and judged against a standard of how a grieving family should behave. This public scrutiny, while often messy and unfair, played a role that should not be underestimated. It maintained pressure on the authorities to continue the investigation long after the initial headlines had faded. It ensured that Gus's face was not forgotten, that his story was kept alive in the public consciousness. This community and digital vigilance, for all its flaws, became a guardian of Gus's memory, a constant, nagging reminder that a little boy was still missing and that the answers, whatever they were, likely lay with the people who shared that isolated property with him. The disappearance of Gus Lamont remains an open wound, a story without an ending. The key takeaways from this tragedy are etched in the details of the failed search and the puzzling human behavior that followed. First, the critical importance of the first hours after a child goes missing cannot be overstated. A delay of even minutes can irrevocably alter the outcome. Second, a complete absence of physical evidence in a natural environment is itself a powerful clue, pointing away from a simple accident and toward a more complex scenario. Third, when physical evidence is non-existent, investigators must turn to behavioral evidence, where inconsistencies, delays, and emotional detachment can form a compelling, if circumstantial, narrative. Finally, the role of the community and public vigilance is vital, providing the pressure and persistence needed to ensure that a missing child is never forgotten. The case of Gus Lamont is a haunting reminder that sometimes the most profound mysteries are not about what is present, but about what is absent, a footprint, a cry, a tear, a coherent story. It is the silence that speaks the loudest, and in that silence, the search for a little boy lost in the vastness of the outback continues. If you found this deep dive into one of Australia's most perplexing mysteries compelling, please subscribe for more thoughtful investigative content.